Welcome to Decades of Heistory, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. It's time to juxtapose the most stereotypical bank robbery with one of the oddest heists of 1926. We'll return to Texas for the unique and novel robbery, but first we'll stop in Minnesota for a good old-fashioned, violent, guns a-blazing, daring, daylight, dastardly dash of daring do. Anyway, these two heists will put a wrap on the year, and they won't disappoint as we tackle two main stories for December 1926 on Decades of Heistory. The Saturday, December 4, 1926 Brownsville Herald appears to have been the first to get the information off the AP wire. Not wanting to let a lurid tale like this go unpublished, they went to press with what would become, at least in part, an erroneous run-on sentence. They noted 3 or more robbers, armed with rifles, hit the Olmsted County Bank in Rochester, Minnesota shortly after it opened. They gunned their way out of it. They allegedly netted about $10,000 and wounded 2 unnamed police officers in the heist. We'll name them shortly, and they will be added to the Memorial Honor Roll. The producer's news story from Friday, December 10th, 1926 appeared to be a summation of the APs, though they noted that there was a getaway driver in addition to the 3 bandits who entered the bank. They added that President Dobbelstein, named Dabblestein in subsequent articles, was locked in the vault with the other bank employees. Allegedly, one of the robbers who was standing guard called out, quote, "Here comes the bulls," end quote, prompting them to make a quick egress from the bank to their car. Now, we typically think of bulls in prison movies, and that means guards. In this case, it's clearly a broader meaning of law enforcement in general. The getaway driver hit the gas and the car headed south to the Iowa border. Just below that story was another titled "Bandit Leader is Identified." It stated that the bandits were members of a gang of bank robbers well known to police in the Twin Cities. Bank President Dabblestein identified a photo of a, quote, "dark-complexioned, hook-nosed man," end quote, as that of the bandit who knocked him down and stood over him with drawn revolvers while others pillaged the vault. A St. Paul detective brought the photo of the man to Rochester, and it showed a man known, quote, in police circles, end quote, as Blackie. Yes, this would be the 4th or 5th robber nicknamed Blackie we've come across during this survey of 1926. I'm hoping that for 1927 and beyond, they come up with something more original, maybe Blondie. Anyway, Blackie apparently worked with 2 different gangs that had been allegedly involved in a string of bank heists in the upper Midwest. Meanwhile, bank officers were on their way to confirm the loss, while President Dabblestein said the loss was closer to 30,000 versus the original 10,000. Quote, "Tearing a page from the history of the notorious James Younger gang," end quote, 6 bandits held up a Rochester, Minnesota bank, which they determined was, quote, "southern Minnesota's most daring raid of its kind in a half-century," end quote. By way of an update, we now learn that one of the 6 robbers remained outside in the getaway car, while another provided some form of lookout around a block or so away from the bank. Meanwhile, 4 of the remaining 6 entered Olmsted County Bank and apparently utilized a combination of shooting and cursing to quell and intimidate the bank employees. They beat the president, Charles F. Dabblestein, and fired shots at the other bank workers. All of these temporary hostages were forced to lie on the floor under the guard of 2 robbers. Meanwhile, the other 2 robbers loaded the loot, consisting of currency and Liberty Bonds. The boisterousness, as well as an alarm, brought patrolman Chester Fellows and W.H. Hutchins to the bank entrance just about the time the bank bandits were fleeing. There was a quick exchange of gunfire where both officers were hit in the legs. Somehow it appears that none of the quartet of criminals was struck. Within about an hour, your typical posse of county law enforcement, and in this case the county rangers, and volunteer citizens, businessmen, were crawling across southern Minnesota while, quote, every road heading into Iowa bristled with patrols, end quote. Making the posse's situation more difficult was a growing snowstorm. It was noted to be the first bank heist in Minnesota of 1926 and the first since the county rangers took over statewide control of fighting crime. Lastly, the Sunday, December 5th, 1926 morning edition of the Douglas Daily Dispatch ran an AP version of the story which was practically verbatim to that of the Sunday Stars, though they did add some critical elements. Tacked on were 2 full paragraphs. One stated that 2 suspects were being held in Rochester, Minnesota, one Gus Anderson and Otto Burns, both of whom stated they lived in Minneapolis, had been arrested at Cannon Falls, Minnesota, after they boarded a bus headed for the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Both were noted to, quote, be roughly dressed, end quote, and were, quote, in no mood for conversation, end quote, post-arrest, which makes sense. So we've got some good leads in this case, but a bunch of questions as well, including the actual confirmed number of robbers, to which gang or gangs, if any, did they belong, how much money was actually taken, did the other 4 get away, and more. So this story will become a follow-up in the months ahead as information avails itself. But you'd probably agree that this comes across as your standard aggressive, kind of a brute force style of bank robbery, right? So now we'll switch from Minnesota to Texas and from the brutish to the demure. This story has enough twists and turns to have grabbed the attention of 10 editions only for December 1926. The Sunday Star jumps right in where we learn that the chief of police, one J.N. Littlepage, said charges of robbery would be filed on an unnamed woman who was identified by cashier S.A. Jameson and bookkeeper Wayman Howe, 2 men she allegedly locked in a Buda, Texas bank vault. Here's how the Buda heist happened. A girl, described as brunette, weighing between 110 and 115 pounds, quietly dressed, not over 16 to 18 years of age, appeared in the bank an hour or so before the heist and walked into the bank posing as a newspaper woman. She borrowed a typewriter in the rear of the building and told officials that she'd been sent to write an article about the little town of Buda, which at that time was a population of about 300. She chatted with half a dozen visitors, but apparently waited until all the customers had left for lunch about noon. When all but Jameson and Howe remained to go to lunch, she drew a gun and commanded, quote, stand where you are, end quote. Then she ordered them both into the vault. Aiming the gun at Jameson's head, she told him to unlock the safe and, quote, dig that money out, end quote. Jameson handed her 2 packages of currency, each containing about $1,200. A third dropped to the floor that was apparently unnoticed by her. Then she slammed the vault door closed. People on the street apparently had no reason to even suspect a robbery was occurring. They noticed her calmly exit the bank as, quote, the flapper bandit escaped in her coupe, end quote, on the post road toward Austin. We also learned about arson charges that were being heaped onto her slender shoulders. Okay, so that's the Buda heist. Coincidentally, It seems that Bank President Tom Nelson of the Farmer State Bank at Round Rock, Texas, revealed that a lone woman answering similar description to that of the Buddha bank robber had, quote, hung around, end quote, his bank for several days this week. Apparently, the unidentified woman represented herself to be a Waco, Texas newspaper woman. This sounds familiar, and it appears that she must have been scoping out both banks and trying to figure out which bank would be the better one to rob. So here's a skinny on the Round Rock, Texas situation. Nelson stated that the woman came into the bank and yelled fire, not once but several times, but that he and the bank employees paid her little attention. That situation alone is odd. Coincidentally, a vacant house did burn in Round Rock, Texas, the evening of Friday, December 10th. Well, this unidentified woman then returned to the bank on Saturday, December 11th, and was questioned by employees about the fire, to which she denied any knowledge. While in the bank, she asked customers about crop conditions, and several times she asked bank employees about what they did in the case of a fire, including whether they, quote, dashed out of the bank, end quote. Well, now we learn that a Miss Rebecca Bradley was arrested after officers checked the license number on her car, which was found on a car wash rack at a garage. She was taken into custody. Witness Frank Hill identified Miss Rebecca Bradley as the girl whose automobile he pulled out of the mud on a lonely road at the back of his house, 5 miles south of the location of the Buda, Texas robbery on the afternoon of the robbery. He said she stuck a bill in his pocket as payment, but that he returned it. He related that he instead gave her a fatherly lecture when she called her mother on the telephone and told her that she was stuck in the mud, but lied about her location, saying she was on an Austin, Texas street. Hill made her call her mother back to let her know the real location. Just imagine that happening today. Now, the Brownsville Herald, at least in 1926, loved them some crazy stories, and this one fits. Using size 5,000 font, the front page's main title ran, "Moody Stenog Held in Robbery." 2 massive subtitles later, I get the feeling that due to Miss Bradley's relationship with the governor-elect, Dan Moody, that this story was going political. As if the political angle wasn't titillating enough, we fast forward to a courtroom scene where her college peers filled to capacity to watch the habeas corpus bond hearing under Judge O.S. Lattimore. Lattimore set a bail at $5,000. This story states that Miss Rebecca Bradley was 21 and noted that she would likely be released from the Hay County Jail at San Marcos, Texas before daybreak on Sunday. A bond for her release was signed by the Austin, Texas Mayor, P.W. McFadden, Dr. Charles Ramsdell, a professor of history at the University of Texas, and attorney John Coffer. These appear to be heavy hitters and demonstrates that she was seemingly well connected. Well, the Herald stated that, quote, Rebecca Rogers had been arrested several hours earlier by officers who had been on the search for, quote, the Flapper Bandit, end quote. A term I'm sure they hope caught on. But wait, Rebecca Rogers? I thought her name was Rebecca Bradley. Well, I said twists and turns, so more on that shortly. Miss Grace E. Bradley, Rebecca's mother, and an employee of the state of Texas in an insurance department role of some sort, said, "It's ridiculous to think that they're holding my slip of a girl for bank robbery," end quote. A third contiguous story titled Moody Says Little noted that, quote, Miss Bradley had been recommended by a friend for her job as a stenographer for Governor-elect Moody, and that he'd seen very little of her, but he always considered her to be efficient. Moody's first inkling that something was awry was when he overheard one of his assistants say that Miss Bradley hadn't shown up for work at the office since early Friday morning. Well, he immediately ordered an investigation to find out why she'd been absent for 2 days. Then the police called and asked if Miss Bradley drove a car, and if so, did he have access to the license number. In another strange twist, just before Moody, who was heading to attend an event in San Antonio, Rebecca's mother called to inform the office that her daughter had taken her car to get it washed. Well, Moody, on his way to San Antonio, leaving Austin, passed a garage on his way to the train station, so he stopped in to see if the car was there. He identified it by the license number and called his office to let them know. Quote, somewhat pale but maintaining her composure, end quote, Rebecca Bradley appeared in the courtroom of Judge Calhoun. She was, quote, quietly but stylishly dressed and smiled as she cheerfully greeted her attorneys, end quote. Police determined that the pistol Miss Bradley allegedly used was old and rusty, which is great, but to me it doesn't affect whether or not she could have killed someone with it, or at the very least have intimidated people with it. Those close to her believe she may have been suffering from a nervous disorder brought on by overwork. But as a stenographer, that to me sounds like gamesmanship, as you will see in yet another twist shortly. So there have been a few oddities so far, but wait, what's this? One Mrs. Rebecca Bradley Rogers had been officially charged with robbing the Farmers National Bank in Buda, Texas, on Saturday, December 11th, with the use of firearms. Rebecca Rogers was granted bail for $5,000 in the Travis District Court. Now, as noted, Rogers, or the robber, had been identified by bank employees Jameson and Howe. Meanwhile, Sheriff George Allen of Hays County, who arrested her, noted that she'd made a statement which led to the recovery of most of the loot. So here's yet another plot twist. You've noticed the switch from Miss Rebecca Bradley to Mrs. Rebecca Bradley Rogers. Now we meet an Otis Rogers, who was a young Amarillo, Texas attorney. Well, it turns out that they had maintained total secrecy regarding their marriage that took place sometime in 1925 while both were students at the University of Texas. They were married at Georgetown, Texas, and continued taking their university courses until he graduated from law school. She completed her courses, garnering a Bachelor of Arts in History. Strangely, they decided that his income might prove inadequate to support a household, so they agreed to separate while he worked on developing his law practice. Note, we consider this a red flag. So Miss Rebecca Rogers got her job as a stenographer in the office of Governor-elect Dan Moody, but she got her job under the name Miss Rebecca Bradley, and even continued to pursue an advanced degree in the form of a Master of Arts in American History. Attorney Rogers appeared in court in defense of his wife for the first time on December 14th during that bond hearing. The couple had hidden the marriage so well that Rebecca's mother even denied that they were actually married when she heard that this Otis Rogers was going to defend her. The Daily Alaska Empire was a member of the Associated Press and ran a summation of what the Evening Star ran. For some reason, they split it into two stories. The first, titled Girl Robber Proves Bride of Attorney, was subtitled New Interest Created in Texas Bank Robbery, Girl is Identified, which spent more time with the title and subtitle than the actual content of the article. Beneath the story was another tidier title of Bride is Composed. Yet despite the pithiness, it really provided nothing additional. The Indianapolis Times ran a second edition on December 15th. Not sure why, but appearing on the front page, yet buried at the bottom of column 8, is a story titled Puzzle Over Motive. It's subtitled Flapper Bandit's Friends Speculate After Bank Robbery. This snippet of a story was so hidden that two others jump out on the front page. One story titled Drinks Muriatic Acid was a story about a man who got so thirsty for booze that he mistakenly drank from an old jug that was loaded with acid. Spoiler alert, he wasn't too seriously injured. The other strange story that jumps out was titled Elephant Captured, and it chronicled the 6-ton pachyderm named Diamond who'd broken free in Kansas and ran roughshod for 5 days in 5 counties. Those stories helped tone down the Flapper Bandit story a little bit. Her friends appeared puzzled as to her motive for the bank heist and considered that she did it for the thrill or to ease some financial burdens. Neither of those answers really are shocking or earth-shattering. Somehow, lastly for this saga, the Bismarck Tribune ran a tiny one-liner under a grab bag of appropriately named news briefs, harkening back to Rebecca yelling fire in the bank that she was presumably scouting in Round Rock, Texas, and coincidentally the site of a random house fire. It added, quote, arson charges filed at Georgetown, Texas against Miss Rebecca Bradley Rogers, already accused of bank robbery, end quote. Well, that's a wrap on part 4 of December 1926. Where on earth will this story take us? Will Rebecca go to jail? Was she sane enough to stand trial? I'm not judging, but this is an odd story, but because she was a she, it may be prosecuted differently. We'll certainly add any new information in follow-ups over the upcoming months, as well as any news from the seemingly more mundane Rochester, Minnesota heist. Next up will be the 1926 year in review, tallying all of the data and highlights from this year's stories. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of Heistory. Till next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye bye, blackbird.